The evening was foggy. The old maples around Henry White's house rustled their leaves as if whispering to each other. Henry sat on the squeaky rocking chair on his porch, staring at the darkening sky. War, youth, friendship, those days were long behind him, but the memories sometimes resurfaced like the wreckage of a sunken ship. He had long grown accustomed to the silence and solitude, though every evening he still hoped for a miracle. Tonight, that miracle arrived. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. The mailman, a young guy with a tired face, handed Henry an envelope. It was a plain white envelope without a stamp, just his name and address written in familiar handwriting. Henry furrowed his brow. For a moment, it felt like his heart skipped a beat. That handwriting hadn't crossed his path since his best friend Charlie Reeves had gone missing. For a moment, he froze, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside, there was only one handwritten page. "Henry, if you're reading this, it means I found a way to reach you. Remember the old bridge? I'll meet you there. Charlie?" Henry reread the note several times, trying to find any rational explanation in it. But all he could feel was a wave of memories crashing over him. He and Charlie had been friends since childhood. They used to play in the woods, build forts, and explore the old bridge on the outskirts of town. That bridge had become not only a place of adventure, but also a refuge where they escaped from the real world. Then came the war. Henry and Charlie enlisted on the same day. They were sure they'd be inseparable. But fate had other plans. Vietnam became their hell on earth. Charlie went missing during one of the operations, and no one had heard from him since. Henry had tried to find any trace of his friend, but his search always ended in a dead end. And now, this letter. But how was this possible? If Charlie was alive, why had he been silent for 50 years? The next morning started just like any other for Henry. The smell of coffee, the sounds of the morning news from the old radio, and the tremor in his hands caused not only by age, but also by the anxiety from yesterday's letter. He decided to share it with Allison Brooks, his longtime friend. She was the kind of woman Henry could talk to about anything, and the one who always found a way to snap him out of his shell, even when he closed himself off. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Allison said when Henry entered her cozy home, filled with books and old newspaper clippings. "Maybe I have," Henry muttered, handing her the letter. "It's from Charlie, or at least someone wants me to think it is." Allison read the note carefully, then looked up at Henry. "But that's impossible, right? She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "Missing in action," Henry finished for her. "Yeah, I know, but what if it's true? What if he's alive? I can't just sit here and do nothing." "You're right," Allison nodded. "But you need someone to look at this with a clear head. Let me go with you." Henry wanted to object, but Allison was already throwing on her coat. The old bridge looked just as it had in Henry's youth. The wooden planks, covered in moss, creaked underfoot, and the fog curled over the water, hiding the dark current below. Henry and Allison stood on the bridge, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. No one came. "Henry, look here," Allison pointed to a gap under one of the boards. "Something's hidden here." They lifted the board and found a small metal box. Henry opened it with trembling hands. Inside were old photographs, notes, and a journal. The box was scratched with initials, CR. "It's his," Henry whispered. Allison picked up one of the photos. It showed Henry, Charlie, and several other soldiers sitting around a campfire. On the back of the photo was a message: "Don't trust them." "Henry, what does this mean?" Allison asked, but Henry just shook his head. He had no idea who they couldn't trust or why Charlie left that message. On the way home, Henry felt like they were being watched. A car with dimmed headlights followed them at a distance, but when Henry turned onto his street, it disappeared. Allison noticed the car's strange behavior too. "Looks like we've caught someone's attention," she remarked. Henry just nodded. He couldn't shake two thoughts from his mind. If Charlie really left this journal, he wanted Henry to find it. But who else knew about it? That night, Henry lay awake for a long time. Memories of Charlie mixed with unsettling thoughts about how their small town might be hiding more secrets than he could have ever imagined. The letter, the bridge, the box, this was just the beginning, and the question that kept gnawing at him grew louder. How could a man who had been missing for 50 years make contact? The next morning, Henry and Allison decided to return to the old bridge, armed with flashlights, a shovel, and a strong determination to uncover what had been so carefully hidden. The box they found the day before contained too many hints and not enough answers. Charlie's old journal, filled with illegible handwriting, left more questions than it provided explanations. Allison insisted they analyze the entries and figure out what Henry's friend had kept silent about for so long. "If he wanted you to find this, then there's something important here," she said, flipping through the pages of the journal. "There are dates, locations. Some pages are torn out. It looks like he was trying to encode something. You think someone did this on purpose?" Henry frowned. "Or did he do it himself?" "Maybe both," Allison speculated, holding a page up to the light. "Look, there are fingerprints, like someone was hurriedly flipping through it. The journal had been tampered with before we got to it." Her words sent a shiver down Henry's spine. He turned toward the window, half expecting to see a shadow outside, but there was nothing. "Then we need to figure out who else knows about this journal," he said, "and why it's coming to the surface now." The old bridge greeted them with the same fog and eerie silence as the day before. They carefully searched the area where they'd hidden the box. Allison noticed several footprints around that definitely didn't belong to them. "Someone's been here after us," she remarked, crouching down and pointing at the fresh shoe prints. "These are brand new. Look, right here." Henry examined the ground, trying to remember if he had seen these prints yesterday, but his memory failed him. "Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find everything," he muttered. "But who are they? And why did they come here?" Allison began inspecting the bridge more thoroughly. Under one of the rotting planks, she found a rusty metal cylinder. Carefully, she extracted it, fearful of damaging it. "Looks like a container for maps or documents," she said. "Could this be part of the evidence?" They opened the cylinder right there. Inside was a small piece of paper with coordinates and one word: "Shore." Allison immediately wrote it down in her notebook. "Looks like a lead to another location," she suggested. "If that's the case, then it's something big," Henry replied. "But don't forget, someone's clearly ahead of us." When they got back to town, Allison insisted on checking the coordinates. She called her old friend Ben Carter, a former detective who now lived in a nearby town. Ben was known for his ability to find details where others saw only chaos. "Are you sure you want to dig into this?" Ben asked when they showed him the journal and the coordinates. "You realize this could be dangerous?" "Charlie was my friend," Henry said firmly. "I can't just leave this alone." "Then let me help." Ben nodded. "I'll check the coordinates and see what I can find. But you two need to be careful. This isn't just a detective game. If someone's already watching you, they clearly don't want you to reach the end." Ben set off for the shore, the place marked by the coordinates, while Henry and Allison waited for news. But by evening, their peace was shattered. A car pulled up to Henry's house. Nobody got out, but the car stayed there for several hours before driving off. Allison looked out the window and saw the car disappear around the corner. "This isn't a coincidence anymore," she said. "Someone's definitely keeping an eye on us." "You think they're connected to those people who were searching for the box?" Henry asked. "I don't know," Allison answered, "but it's time to tell Ben." The next morning Ben called. His voice sounded tense. "The coordinates led me to an old warehouse. There's definitely something that used to be stored there, but everything's been cleared out, like someone knew you'd come. The only thing I found was some tire tracks and part of a document. It's burned, but you can still see it had a military seal." These words confirmed Henry and Allison's worst fears. Everything pointed to the fact that Charlie had been involved in something bigger than they could have imagined. "Ben, we need to meet," Allison said. "We've got more questions." "All right, but let's do it in a safe place," Ben replied. "Meet me at the old library on the edge of town." That evening, Henry and Allison saw the same car again, parked near the house. This time, they decided to take action. Henry grabbed a flashlight and went outside, approaching the car. But when he got close, the vehicle suddenly sped off into the night. "That's a warning," Allison said when Henry returned to the house. "They know we're looking for something. Now the question is, how far are they willing to go to stop us?" "And who are they?" Henry asked. "Charlie trusted me. I can't just let this go, Allison. She nodded, though her eyes showed concern. Charlie's journal and the clues they'd found were just the tip of the iceberg, and they both knew that what lay ahead was far more dangerous. The old reading room in the library on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place for a meeting. The tall wooden shelves, smelling of ancient paper, created a sense of coziness and safety. But Henry and Allison knew that this feeling was deceptive. The silence around them seemed to amplify the unease that had been lingering for the past few days. Ben Carter was sitting at one of the far tables, flipping through a notebook. When they walked in, he looked up and motioned for them to join him. His gaze was tense. "You're right on time," he said, putting the notebook into his jacket pocket. "I found something that might shed some light on your questions, but I'm afraid the answers won't be what you want to hear." Henry sat across from him, resting his hands on the table. Allison sat next to him, her notebook ready. "What did you find?" Henry asked, his worry evident. "The document I found at the warehouse was part of a dossier related to a covert operation in Vietnam," Ben began, lowering his voice. "Operation Grayson. I've heard of it before, but all the materials were classified. Only high-ranking military officials knew it even existed. It looks like Charlie was somehow involved in it." "Operation Grayson?" Henry repeated, furrowing his brow. "I've never heard of it. What was it about?" "It was a mission to extract critically important information behind enemy lines," Ben continued. "Official reports say the team involved was wiped out, but if Charlie left these records, it means he knew something he shouldn't have, and someone was trying to hide it." Allison quickly wrote down everything Ben said, then looked up. "How does this tie into the journal and the box we found?" she asked. "That's the thing," Ben replied. "Charlie's records might contain information that could compromise people still in power. That explains why someone's been tailing you. They can't let you get to the truth." Henry felt his fists clench. Memories of Charlie, his smile, their conversations, moments of camaraderie, now mixed with the heavy realization that his friend might have been involved in something much bigger. "So Charlie didn't just disappear," he said slowly. "He was made to vanish." Ben nodded. "Probably knew they were going to find him, so he left these clues for you," he said. "But you need to be careful. These people won't stop at anything." That evening, Allison returned home while Henry stayed alone, trying to process what he'd just heard. He opened Charlie's journal again and began rereading the entries, hoping to find missed details. The pages, stained by time, held fragments of thoughts, coordinates, dates, all hastily written. One entry caught his attention. May 21st, 1973. "Grayson, heard a conversation at night. Don't trust them. Henry needs to know. If this gets to him, I'm already dead." The words made Henry's blood run cold. Charlie knew they were going to take him out. But who were they? The military, intelligence, or someone from their own team? Suddenly, a knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Henry stood, his heart pounding. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked over to the door and cautiously looked through the peephole. No one. He opened the door and found another envelope on the doorstep. This time, inside was a photograph. It showed 3 people: Charlie, Henry, and a man in military uniform that Henry didn't recognize. On the back of the photo there was a message: "Questions lead to answers, but not always safe ones." The next morning, Henry and Allison met with Ben again to show him the photo. Ben studied it for a long time, then frowned. "This guy in uniform," he said, pointing to the stranger. "That's Colonel Daniel Grayson. He led the operation named after him, but he died in 1974 under strange circumstances. His death closed many questions about the mission." "So it's no coincidence Charlie left this photo," Allison said. "But why now?" "Someone wants you to find the truth," Ben answered. "Or on the other hand, they want you to go the wrong way. This is a game, and the stakes are high." Henry thought for a moment. He felt that everything was now connected. Grayson, Charlie, and what had happened in the past. But where were they supposed to find the answers? Lost in thought, they made their way to the place marked on the back of one of the journal entries. It was another old warehouse, hidden in the woods. When they got there, it was clear that the place had been abandoned for a long time, but inside there were still signs of recent activity. On one of the tables was a charred piece of a map. Allison carefully picked it up. This is part of the mission's route, she said, pointing to the barely visible markings. But what were they looking for? Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the distance. Henry immediately pulled Allison behind a nearby crate, hiding. Two men dressed in black entered the room, their faces concealed by hoods. They shouldn't have come this far, one of them said. If they find this place, we'll have to clean up. Then finish it quickly, the other replied. Henry held his breath. When the men left the warehouse, Allison looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. Now we know who's trying to stop us, she whispered. On the way back to town, Henry thought about what all of this meant. Charlie, Grayson, them, it was all part of some complex puzzle. Yet the main question remained, why were these events resurfacing after so many years? Night had fallen over the city, draping it in a heavy blanket of darkness. Henry and Allison sat in a small diner, avoiding the thought of going back home. They were haunted by worry over Ben. They hadn't been able to reach him since they left the warehouse, and that only made their concern grow stronger. "Do you think something happened to him?" Allison asked, carefully stirring her coffee. Henry gazed out the window, watching the occasional car pass by on the rain-slicked street. "Ben's always been careful, but this is different," he replied. "Those people we saw at the warehouse, they were clearly looking for something. What if they found Ben before we did?" Allison placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him, Henry. If he uncovered something, he must have left us clues. We just need to figure out where to look." Henry nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Suddenly, he remembered the phone call he overheard during their last conversation with Ben. There had been something strange in his voice. A brief pause, like he was about to say something more but got interrupted. Henry stood up abruptly. "His laptop," he exclaimed. "Ben said he kept all his notes on his laptop. If we find it, we'll know what he discovered." Allison instantly understood what he meant. They hurriedly paid and headed for Ben's house. Ben's house was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense trees. When they arrived, the lights in the windows were off. A chill ran down Allison's spine. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she whispered as she got out of the car. "We don't have a choice," Henry replied. "If they got to him, we need to find out what he left behind." They approached the door, and Henry knocked cautiously. There was no answer. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, chaos reigned. Books, papers, and furniture were scattered everywhere. This wasn't a simple break-in. Someone had clearly been searching for something. "They've already been here," Allison said, scanning the room. "But why didn't they take anything?" Henry walked over to the desk where Ben's laptop sat. He turned it on, but the screen was blank. The files had been deleted. However, there was a flash drive lying at the edge of the desk. Henry picked it up and looked at Allison. "This might be our shot," he said. "We need to see what's on it." "Let's do it in the car," Allison suggested. "It's too risky here." They quickly left the house, still feeling the eerie sensation of being watched. In the car, Henry plugged the flash drive into his laptop. There was only one file, named Last Chance. Allison stared at the screen, holding her breath. "Open it," she said. Inside was a text document with Ben's notes. He detailed Operation Grayson, its participants, and the reason for its secrecy. Ben mentioned that the mission wasn't just about extracting data. It also involved eliminating witnesses. Charlie had been one of those who knew too much. The document also contained an address, an old hangar outside of town. Ben wrote that this place could hold the key to uncovering the whole truth. "This is a trap," Allison said, reading the text. "They knew he'd leave this for us." "But we have no choice," Henry replied. "If Ben's still alive, he could be there." They reached the hangar in the dead of night. The place looked abandoned, but there was a faint light inside. Henry and Allison entered cautiously, trying not to make a sound. In the center of the hangar, tied up and weakened, sat Ben. His face was battered, but he managed to lift his head when he heard their footsteps. "Get out," he rasped. "It's a trap." Before they could react, the door slammed shut behind them, and several armed men stepped out of the shadows. One of them advanced, holding a gun. "You've gone too far," he said coldly. "Charlie died because he knew the truth. You want to share his fate?" Henry raised his hands, trying to buy time. "We don't know anything," he lied. "We just wanted to find out what happened to our friend." The man smirked. Then you should have left it in the past. But now, it's too late. Allison, seeing one of the men distracted, subtly reached for her phone. She managed to press the emergency call button before they noticed. "What are you doing?" one of them shouted, ripping the phone from her hands. But the sound of police sirens was already heard in the distance. Panic spread among the men in the hangar. One of them grabbed Ben, trying to drag him away, but Henry lunged forward, knocking the man to the ground. A struggle broke out. When the police burst in, the armed men tried to flee, but most of them were apprehended. Ben, though weakened, was freed. Later that night, at the hospital, Ben told them everything he knew. His notes were convincing enough to draw the authorities' attention and kick off an official investigation. "This isn't over," he told Henry and Allison. "The people behind this are still out there, but now we have a chance." The morning was cold and overcast when Henry and Allison found themselves back at the police station. After the events at the hangar, they had become part of the official investigation, but none of the suspects were ready to talk. However, the evidence found at the scene was enough to confirm the involvement of high-ranking officials. This discovery made them both question. Had they truly gotten closer to the truth, or was this just the tip of the iceberg? "Do you think this is the end?" Allison asked, rubbing her temples tiredly. Henry stared thoughtfully at the wall, where the police had pinned up a map with photos and documents gathered in the case. The map highlighted locations tied to Operation Grayson and recent events. "I have a feeling we've only just begun," he replied. "Every time we find an answer, more questions pop up." At that moment, Detective Harper, who was overseeing their case, entered the room. His expression was serious. "We managed to decrypt the data from the flash drive," he said, nodding at the laptop on the desk. "There's something here you need to see." Henry and Allison leaned over the screen. Scanned documents appeared, including the names of the participants in Operation Grayson and reports on its objectives. But the most important thing was a photograph taken just before the mission began. It showed Charlie, a young Henry, and Colonel Daniel Grayson. But in the corner of the frame was another man, whose face seemed vaguely familiar to Henry. "It's him," Henry said, pointing at the man. "One of the people from the hangar that night. How could he have been there all these years later?" Harper frowned. "That's Michael Crawford," he said, "former CIA operative. His name showed up in several classified cases, but officially, he died in 1980. Looks like his death was staged." Allison felt a tightening in her chest. "If he's still alive, maybe others from that group are too," she said. "They could be part of a network that's been protecting the secrets of Operation Grayson." Henry clenched his fists. "So they killed Charlie to cover up the truth. But why let me live?" he wondered aloud. "Maybe Charlie left you a key they never found," Harper suggested. "They've been watching you, waiting for you to lead them right to it." Later that evening, Henry and Allison returned to Henry's house. Fatigue had set in, but they knew they couldn't stop now. While Allison reviewed the documents, Henry suddenly remembered the box they had found in Ben's house. "I missed something," he said, getting up from his seat. "The box with Charlie's personal belongings. There was an old medal I didn't look at." Allison looked up. "Do you think it's important?" "I'm sure," he replied, retrieving the box from the closet. The medal was made of dark metal, and on its back was an engraving in Latin, Veritas liberabit vos, "The truth will set you free." But beneath the engraving were coordinates. "This is where it all began," Henry whispered, realizing that this was the last clue Charlie had left. The coordinates led them to a mountainous area outside of town. An old Cold War-era bunker hidden among the trees looked abandoned. But inside, everything was different. Dusty equipment, folders with documents, and photos telling the story of Operation Grayson. "This is an archive," Allison said, flipping through one of the folders. "Charlie kept everything he could." Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. Henry turned around to see Michael Crawford, holding a gun. "You still don't get what you've gotten yourselves into," he said coldly. "These secrets should have died with us." "But they didn't," Henry replied. "And you know why. The truth always comes out." Crawford aimed his gun, but just then, a voice from around the corner called out, "Drop the weapon, Crawford. You're surrounded." The tension in the room escalated, but Crawford realized he had no way out. He dropped the gun, and he was immediately arrested. The case of Operation Grayson gained widespread attention. Charlie's archive became the key piece of evidence that helped expose crimes hidden for decades. High-ranking officials were arrested, and the secrets of the past began to unfold before the public. Allison looked at Henry as they stood on the porch of his house. "You did it," she said. "Charlie would be proud of you." Henry nodded, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Weeks had passed since Charlie's archive was released to the public, and Michael Crawford was locked up. The Grayson operation case had become the center of media attention. Politicians were scrambling to save face, while high-ranking figures faced questioning and investigations. But for Henry, Allison, and Ben, the story was far from over. They sat in Henry's small living room, surrounded by the remnants of evidence, photos, documents, and maps. On the table was Ben's laptop, filled with notes. "Do you think this is it?" Allison asked, flipping through one of the reports. "We've exposed them, but there are still questions," Henry replied. "For example, who funded the operation? Why are these people still covering it up, even at the risk of their lives?" Ben, sitting at the edge of the couch, squinted slightly. "Maybe it's because they're hiding something bigger. Something that could damage not just them, but the entire system," he suggested. The words hung in the air. Each of them knew that as long as the answers weren't all found, their lives would remain at risk. A few days later, Henry got a call from Detective Harper. There was tension in his voice. "We've got a problem," Harper said. "One of our informants disappeared last night. He was working on the Crawford case." Henry felt a knot form in his chest. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "The informant left a message before he disappeared." "An address. I think you need to see it," Harper replied. The address led them to an old building on the edge of town. It was a long-abandoned hotel, its windows boarded up. Henry, Allison, and Ben arrived late in the evening, armed only with flashlights and determination. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Allison whispered, eyeing the dark building. "We have to," Henry said firmly. "If this is the key to solving it, we can't pass it up." They entered cautiously, moving through dusty hallways. The air was stale, and each step echoed in the empty rooms. Eventually, they found a door leading to the basement. Inside the basement was a small room lit by a dim lamp. On a table lay documents, an old recorder, and photographs. One of the photos showed a young Charlie with Crawford and other team members. "This confirms that Crawford was part of the operation from the start," Ben said. "But what were they doing here?" Allison picked up one of the documents, frowning. "They used this place for secret meetings," she said, "and it looks like they were discussing plans to eliminate witnesses." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, and a man with a gun appeared in the room. It was one of the men who had been part of the attack on the warehouse. "You know too much," he said, his voice cold and threatening. "I should have stopped you back then." Henry, Allison, and Ben froze in place. But then, out of nowhere, Harper appeared with a group of police officers. "Drop the weapon," Harper ordered, "or you'll end up like the rest of them." The man hesitated, but then surrendered. His arrest was the final piece in the chain of events that led to the exposure of the entire network. In the weeks that followed, trials began. Many of those involved in the Grayson operation were held accountable. After long interrogations, Michael Crawford provided information that revealed the full truth. For Henry and Allison, it was a moment of pride, but also one of bitter realization. They had lost friends, endured fear and threats, all in the pursuit of justice. Now their lives were supposed to return to normal. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Henry and Allison discussed the future. "Do you think this is the end?" Allison asked. Henry stared thoughtfully into the flames. "Maybe, but I still have this feeling that there are secrets left to uncover," he said. "Charlie always said the truth is more complicated than it seems." Allison smiled and squeezed his hand. "If there are more questions, we'll find the answers together."